I opened my front door at 4:30 in the morning, expecting fear, but instead, I watched my own son freeze mid-swing, a crowbar still in his hand. He was not there to check on me. He was there to break in, to take everything I had built, and to pretend I no longer had the right to protect it. In that moment, something inside me did not break. It settled. Because I realized this was not desperation. It was betrayal. And they had no idea I had been waiting for this exact moment. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 67 years old, and for most of my life, I was known as one of the most meticulous financial attorneys in Chicago, Illinois. I spent over 4 decades protecting people's assets, unraveling complex disputes, and ensuring that no one could take what did not legally belong to them. I built a career on precision, patience, and an almost instinctive ability to recognize deception before it fully revealed itself. What I never imagined was that one day, those same skills would be the only thing standing between me and my own family. I live alone now, in a historic brick home in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood that has seen generations come and go while I remained quietly rooted in place. The house is large, older than most of the modern developments surrounding it, with polished hardwood floors and tall windows that allow the morning light to spill into every corner. It is not flashy, not designed to impress, but it carries a sense of permanence that I have always valued. Every room reflects a life built with intention rather than excess. My days are simple. I wake early, make my coffee, and sit in the kitchen where the light is softest. I read, I garden, and twice a week I volunteer at the local public library. I also serve as a quiet legal advisor for a community-based charitable foundation, helping them manage donations and avoid the kinds of mistakes that can destroy trust. To most people, I am simply a retired widow living a peaceful and uneventful life. What they do not know is that my financial life is anything but ordinary. Over the years, I structured my assets through carefully layered legal entities, including limited liability companies and irrevocable trusts. The result is a portfolio valued at over $20 million, entirely protected, entirely controlled, and entirely invisible to anyone who does not know where to look. I never spoke about it. Wealth, I learned long ago, is safest when it is quiet. My son, Daniel, used to understand me, or at least I believed he did. When he was younger, he was thoughtful, ambitious, and full of potential. But time has a way of reshaping people. After a series of failed business ventures, something inside him changed. The optimism faded. In its place grew frustration, then resentment. He began to see success as something that had been unfairly withheld from him, rather than something he had failed to build. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, only amplified that shift. She came from a family that once had money, the kind that built identity around appearances and expectations, but their wealth had been slipping away for years, and she carried that loss like a quiet panic beneath her polished exterior. From the moment she entered my life, I could feel it in the way she looked at my home, at my habits, at me. There was always a calculation behind her smile. At first, the changes were subtle. A comment about how large my house was for one person. A suggestion that I should consider planning ahead. Questions about my finances disguised as concern. I answered carefully, never revealing more than necessary. I had spent too many years studying human behavior to ignore what was unfolding right in front of me. I noticed the way Daniel stopped asking how I was doing and started asking what I was doing with my assets. I noticed how Vanessa would fall silent whenever legal matters were mentioned, listening more closely than she pretended to. They thought they were being discreet. They were not. I did not confront them. Not then. I watched. I listened. I waited. Because one thing I have learned over a lifetime of dealing with deception is this: people always reveal their true intentions eventually. And when they do, it is best to be ready. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what changed everything. The morning it began felt no different from any other. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, and moved through my kitchen with the quiet familiarity that comes from years of routine. The coffee brewed slowly, filling the room with a steady, comforting warmth. Outside, Lincoln Park was still half asleep, the streets empty, the air cool and still. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing unusual. That illusion lasted until I checked my phone. The notification came from one of the institutions that managed a portion of my financial structure. It was brief, almost clinical in tone, referencing a recently initiated loan tied to one of my irrevocable trusts. The amount was substantial, large enough that I would have remembered authorizing it. But I had not. I did not react immediately. Years of legal work had trained me to resist instinctive responses. Instead, I set my phone down, poured my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. I read the message again, slower this time, paying attention to the language, the timing, the reference numbers. Nothing about it suggested a system error. It was too precise. I moved to my study and accessed the secured network I maintained for my personal records. Each layer required authentication, each step deliberate. When I reached the transaction logs, the entry was there, exactly as the message had described. The authorization appeared valid. My name, my digital signature, properly formatted and verified. But it was not mine. There are details most people never notice in a signature: small patterns, subtle timing differences, pressure variations in physical form, or cadence in digital replication. I had spent decades examining those details. What I saw on that screen was careful, very careful, but it lacked something intangible. It lacked me. I leaned back in my chair and allowed the silence to settle. This was not an accident. It was not a clerical mistake. Someone had taken the time to replicate my authorization with intent and precision. My mind began to move through recent weeks, replaying conversations, expressions, moments that had felt slightly out of place at the time. Daniel's questions about my financial planning surfaced first. They had been framed casually, almost dismissively, but there had been persistence beneath them. Vanessa's presence lingered in my memory as well, her attention sharpened whenever documents were mentioned, her silence more observant than indifferent. I turned to my security system and accessed the archived footage from the days I had been away at a library conference. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. Daniel appeared on the screen, entering through the garage with a familiarity that should have been comforting, but was not. He moved with purpose, not hesitation, heading directly toward the storage cabinets where I kept older files. He opened drawers, examined folders, and left after several minutes. He had not called me that day. He had not mentioned stopping by. I closed the footage and sat in stillness for a long moment. Suspicion had now crossed into certainty. This was not carelessness or curiosity. It was calculation. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I had not used in years. an old colleague from a federal financial investigations unit. We had worked together on cases that required patience and discretion. I sent a brief message, outlining only the essential facts and requesting a conversation. There was no panic in me, no anger, not yet, only clarity. When Daniel texted me later that afternoon, asking how I was and whether I needed anything, I responded the way I always had, calm, warm, unaware. But I was no longer any of those things, because what I now understood was simple. This was not a mistake. It was the beginning of something deliberate, and I was going to let it continue. If you're still watching and you can feel the tension building, like something bigger is about to unfold, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now let's see how far this really goes. I was already awake when the noise began. It was just after 4:30 in the morning, that quiet hour when the city feels suspended between night and day. I stood in my kitchen, holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the faint outline of the street through the window. Lincoln Park was still. No traffic, no voices, nothing but the distant hum of early deliveries somewhere blocks away. Then I heard it. A sharp metallic strike against wood. I did not move right away. I listened. The sound came again, louder this time, deliberate and forceful. Not an accident, not a loose branch or shifting structure. It was controlled, intentional. I set my cup down and walked slowly toward the hallway, each step measured. The house remained dark, just as I had left it. The only light came from the small screen of the security monitor mounted near my study. I activated the camera feed. The front porch filled the screen. Daniel stood closest to the door, his posture tense, his movements restless. Beside him, Vanessa shifted her weight impatiently, one hand clutching her coat as if the damp air offended her. Between them was a man I did not recognize, holding a metal tool angled against the door frame. He drove it forward again. The sound echoed through the house. Daniel leaned in, speaking quickly, his gestures sharp, urging the man to continue. Vanessa glanced around the street, clearly more concerned about being seen than about what they were doing. Neither of them hesitated. Neither of them questioned the act itself. They believed I was not home. Behind me, the room remained quiet, but I was not alone. 2 federal investigators stood several feet back, watching the same screen in silence. Their presence had been arranged hours earlier, long before the first strike against my door. Everything had been documented, prepared, anticipated. Another hit landed. The wood groaned under the pressure. I turned away from the monitor and walked toward the front entrance. My movements were calm, unhurried, almost routine. The door stood firm, reinforced, unyielding despite their effort. I reached for the first lock and released it. The click was loud. Outside, the noise stopped instantly. I unlocked the second, then the third. Each sound carried through the silence, replacing the violence that had filled the space seconds before. I placed my hand on the handle and paused, not from hesitation, but from certainty. Then I opened the door. Daniel froze mid-motion, his arm still raised as if the action had been interrupted before completion. The man with the tool stepped back immediately, lowering it as though it had suddenly become something incriminating. Vanessa's expression shifted in a single instant, from irritation to disbelief. None of them spoke. The porch light came on behind me, casting a clear, steady glow across their faces. Rain had begun to fall, light but persistent, soaking into their clothes, flattening the illusion of control they had carried with them. I stepped aside slightly. The investigators moved forward into view, their presence quiet but undeniable. Identification was shown, authority established without urgency or aggression. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. This was no longer a private moment. It was something official, something documented. Daniel's voice emerged, unsteady, reaching for an explanation that did not exist. Vanessa attempted to regain composure, her tone sharp, dismissive, but it lacked conviction. The man they had hired did not wait. He turned and left the property without a word, disappearing into the early morning. I remained where I was, watching. There was no anger in me, no raised voice, no demand for justification, only a clear recognition of what stood in front of me. The distance between who Daniel had been and who he was now had finally closed. He had crossed the line himself. And now there was no turning back. If you're still watching and that moment at the door gave you chills, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now let's move into what happens when things turn even darker. After they left that morning, the house returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence I had known for years. It was heavier now, layered with intention, with awareness. I stood in the hallway for a long moment after the investigators stepped out, listening to the echo of the door closing, understanding that what had happened was not an ending. It was an opening move. I did not expect Daniel to apologize. I did not expect regret. What I did not anticipate was how quickly he would adapt. The first signs came subtly. A message from an old acquaintance asking if I had been feeling well lately. A neighbor stopping me during my morning walk, her tone careful, almost rehearsed, as she asked if I needed any help with errands. The concern was polite, but it carried something else beneath it: doubt. It did not take long to understand. Daniel had started speaking. He had chosen a narrative that was both simple and effective. Age, confusion, decline. It was a familiar strategy, one I had seen used in courtrooms more times than I could count. If you could not take control directly, you questioned capacity. You created uncertainty around judgment. Vanessa, however, moved with more precision. A few days later, I received an email from the board of the charitable foundation where I served as a legal advisor. The language was formal, neutral on the surface, but the intent was unmistakable. They requested a meeting to review current operational responsibilities and ensure continuity of oversight. It was the kind of phrasing designed to sound procedural while signaling concern. I attended without objection. The room felt different that afternoon. People I had worked with for years avoided direct eye contact. Questions were asked carefully, framed in a way that allowed them to observe rather than confront. I answered each one clearly, without hesitation, without defensiveness. I had no intention of giving them what they expected to see. When I returned home, another document was waiting. This one came by certified delivery. I opened it at my kitchen table, reading each page slowly, absorbing not just the words but the structure behind them. Daniel had filed a formal petition for legal guardianship over my financial affairs. The claims were thorough. He cited behavioral concerns, alleged inconsistencies, even referenced the incident at my front door as evidence of instability. It was well constructed. He had learned enough over the years to imitate the process, but not enough to understand its full weight. This was no longer an attempt to access money quietly. This was a move to take control entirely, through the system itself. I set the papers aside and allowed myself a moment of stillness. Then I began working. I contacted the investigators and provided them with updated information. Together, we expanded the scope of the financial review, tracing transactions beyond the initial loan. Patterns began to emerge. Transfers processed faster than standard protocol allowed, authorizations that bypassed normal verification delays. It pointed to something specific. Someone inside the bank. Vanessa had not acted alone. She had positioned herself carefully, using access points I had not yet identified, relying on individuals who understood how to move funds without raising immediate suspicion. It was not reckless. It was calculated. That realization changed the nature of the situation. This was no longer just a family conflict. It was a coordinated effort. I did not confront them. Not yet. Instead, I maintained the same routine. I responded to Daniel's messages with calm, neutral replies. I continued my work, attended meetings, moved through my days as if nothing had shifted. The appearance of normalcy became its own strategy, because the more confident they felt, the less careful they would become. And if they believed I was already losing control, they would push further. I was prepared to let them. Sometimes the most effective way to win is to allow the other side to believe they already have. If you're still watching and realizing this is no longer just a family issue, but something much deeper, comment number 4 below so I know you're still here. Now, let's move into the breaking point. The invitation arrived 3 days after the guardianship petition. It was written in Vanessa's voice, though Daniel's name appeared alongside hers, as if that detail alone could soften its intent. The message spoke of reconciliation, of family, of the importance of resolving misunderstandings before things escalated further. It suggested a private meeting at a property outside the city, somewhere quiet, somewhere neutral. There was nothing neutral about it. I accepted anyway. The drive out of Chicago took less than an hour, but the distance felt deliberate. The streets grew wider, the houses larger, each one carefully placed behind gates and manicured hedges. The property they had chosen stood at the end of a long driveway lined with trimmed trees that felt more decorative than natural. It was impressive in the way that wealth often is when it is meant to be seen. But it did not feel like a home. I parked, stepped out, and took a moment to observe the structure before walking inside. The air carried a stillness that was too controlled, too arranged, as if even the silence had been curated. They were already waiting. Daniel stood near the window. His posture rigid. Daniel added little. He watched me more than he spoke, as if trying to anticipate my response before I gave it. Then Vanessa opened the folder. Inside was a formal agreement, structured with legal precision. It outlined the transfer of control over my financial assets, granting Daniel full authority to manage them. In exchange, provisions were made for my relocation into a private residential care facility. The language was clean, almost elegant in its execution. It was also entirely transparent in its purpose. I read through the pages slowly, allowing the silence to stretch between us. I could feel their attention fixed on me, waiting for hesitation, for uncertainty, for weakness. They found none. When I reached the final page, I closed the folder and placed it gently back on the table. I will not be signing this. The words were calm, unforced, carrying no anger, only certainty. The shift in the room was immediate. Vanessa's expression tightened, the control in her posture slipping just enough to reveal the impatience beneath it. Daniel straightened, his composure beginning to fracture, his breathing more noticeable now. I looked at them both, not as adversaries, but as individuals who had misunderstood something fundamental. My assets are not structured the way you believe they are, I said evenly. They are held within a legal trust that includes specific conditions regarding inheritance. I paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle. If any beneficiary is found to have engaged in fraudulent activity or attempted to unlawfully seize control, their right to inherit is permanently revoked. Daniel's reaction was immediate. The color drained from his face, his focus shifting from me to the document as if it might suddenly confirm what he had not considered. Vanessa dismissed it at first, a quick denial, a reflex more than a reasoned response. But doubt had already entered the room. "You are not securing anything," I continued. "You are disqualifying yourselves." The silence that followed was no longer controlled. It was fractured. Daniel spoke then, but the steadiness was gone from his voice. Vanessa's composure dissolved into visible frustration, her earlier restraint replaced by something sharper, less contained. I stood, leaving the folder exactly where it was. There was nothing more to discuss. As I walked out, I did not look back. I did not need to. Because I understood something they did not. When ambition loses its balance, it does not lead to success. It leads to collapse. When I returned home from that meeting, the house felt exactly as it always had. Quiet, ordered, unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the walls or the furniture, but in the trajectory of what was unfolding. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, allowing the silence to settle around me. There was no sense of victory in what had just happened, no satisfaction in refusing them, only clarity. Daniel was no longer navigating uncertainty. He had been given a boundary, clearly defined, and he had reacted exactly as I expected. He did not step back. He did not reconsider. He tightened his grip on a plan that was already collapsing. Vanessa would not allow anything else. Over the next 2 days, the pattern became more obvious. The investigators shared updates with me as they tracked activity connected to the accounts Daniel had accessed. Transactions increased in both frequency and urgency. Smaller transfers at first, then larger ones, each processed with less caution than the last. It was not strategy. It was pressure. There were external forces at play now, financial obligations that could no longer be delayed, expectations that had to be met. Whatever Daniel had built, whatever illusion he had been maintaining, it was no longer sustainable. And when people feel that kind of pressure, they do not become more careful. They become reckless. I reviewed the data in my study, the glow of the screen reflecting against the dark wood of the desk. The numbers told a story that words could not soften. Funds moving through channels that should not have been accessible, authorizations executed at times that suggested urgency rather than planning. He was searching for something immediate, a solution that did not exist. Then the call came. One of the investigators informed me that an unusual access point had been triggered within the financial system tied to the charitable foundation I had worked with for years. It was not a coincidence. The timing aligned perfectly with the escalation we had been observing. Daniel had turned his attention there. The realization settled slowly, not as shock, but as a confirmation. He understood that my personal assets were no longer within his reach, at least not in the way he had intended, so he shifted towards something more vulnerable, something he believed he could manipulate: the foundation. He still had enough knowledge of its structure, enough familiarity with its operations to attempt entry. He knew I had stepped away. He knew others were now managing access, but he also believed the system could be bent, and he was willing to try. The transaction was executed late that night. By the time I received confirmation, the funds had already been moved, a significant amount transferred through a series of layered accounts before settling into a corporate entity that had been quietly established weeks earlier. Vanessa's involvement was unmistakable. This was no longer an attempt to test boundaries or exploit opportunity. This was theft, direct, irreversible. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of fatigue, but to mark the shift that had just occurred. There is always a line, a point at which intention becomes action and action becomes consequence. Daniel had reached that point. He had crossed it without hesitation, and now there was nothing left to prevent what would follow. When he contacted me the next morning, his message was calm, almost casual, asking how I was doing, as if the world had not changed overnight. I responded in kind, my tone steady, my words familiar, because he still believed he was in control. And I was willing to let him believe that, for a little longer, because once someone chooses the path he had chosen, there is no strategy left that can undo it. There is only outcome. If you're still watching and you can feel that everything is about to collapse, comment number 6 below to let me know you're ready. Now let's move on to chapter 7, where the truth finally comes out. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, but the tension had settled long before anyone took their seats. The foundation's main hall was filled beyond capacity, every chair occupied, every quiet conversation carrying the same uneasy question. No one understood how so much money could disappear overnight, but everyone knew the answer would not be simple. I arrived early and took a seat near the front, not out of obligation, but because I preferred to see everything clearly. The room felt different than it had in years past. Familiar faces avoided direct eye contact, their expressions cautious, uncertain. Conversations lowered as I passed, replaced by silence that was louder than any accusation. I did not respond to it. I simply waited. Daniel entered shortly after, his posture rigid, his movements controlled in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. Vanessa walked beside him, composed on the surface, but there was tension in the way she held herself, in the slight delay before each step. They did not acknowledge me. They did not need to. The meeting began with formal statements, carefully worded explanations that revealed nothing while acknowledging everything. The board members spoke about discrepancies, about investigations, about the need for clarity. But beneath their language was urgency. Then Daniel stood. The shift in the room was immediate. He turned toward the audience, his expression strained in a way that invited sympathy. When he began to speak, his voice carried just enough emotion to sound convincing without losing control. He said he knew what had happened. He spoke about my role with the foundation, about my past access, about the trust that had once been placed in me. He framed everything as concern, as regret, as the painful recognition of something that should never have occurred. Then he made the accusation. He said I had taken the money. Vanessa followed without hesitation, reinforcing his claim with quiet certainty, her tone steady, her words precise. Together, they constructed a narrative that was simple enough to believe. Age, confusion, poor judgment, a tragic decline. The room responded exactly as they expected. Whispers spread quickly, uncertainty shifting toward suspicion. I could feel the weight of it, the subtle turning of perception, the readiness to accept the explanation placed in front of them. It was not personal. It was human. I remained seated until the room settled. Then I stood. There was no need to raise my voice, no need to challenge them directly. I walked to the front, connected my tablet to the display system, and turned toward the screen as it came to life. The first document appeared, a bank statement, clear and precise, detailing the transaction in question. I allowed a moment for it to register before moving to the next. A transfer log, mapping the movement of funds through each stage, each account, each timestamp aligned with accuracy that could not be disputed. The room grew quiet. I continued. The final document filled the screen. A corporate registration, legally verified, identifying the receiving entity. The name stood at the center, unmistakable. Vanessa Clark. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. The silence that followed was complete, the kind that does not invite interruption. It carried understanding, realization, and the slow collapse of everything that had been said minutes earlier. Daniel's composure broke first. The certainty he had projected vanished, replaced by something unsteady, something exposed. Vanessa reacted with denial, her voice sharper now, less controlled, but it did not matter. The evidence remained. I stepped back, allowing the room to absorb what had been placed before it. Truth does not argue. It does not persuade. It simply exists. And once it is seen, nothing else can stand in its place. The silence that followed the final document did not last long. Vanessa was the first to react, her composure fracturing into sharp denial. Her voice rose, cutting through the stillness with urgency that bordered on desperation. She dismissed the evidence as fabrication, questioned its validity, and attempted to redirect attention back toward me. Daniel stood beside her, less certain, his movements slower, his focus shifting between the screen and the faces in the room as if searching for something to hold on to. The atmosphere shifted quickly from shock to unrest. I did not engage with their reaction. There was no value in arguing, no advantage in raising my voice. Everything that needed to be said had already been shown. What remained was simply to complete the picture. I stepped forward again and connected a second file to the system. This time, it was not a document. It was a timeline. Each entry marked with precision, detailing the sequence of events that led to the transfer, access points, authorization attempts, communication intervals. The structure was clear, methodical, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Then I introduced the final element, the bank employee. Vanessa had relied on someone inside the system, an individual positioned to bypass safeguards and accelerate transactions. It had been a calculated move, one that allowed her to operate with confidence, believing that internal cooperation would shield her from scrutiny. What she did not know was that the same individual had been working with us. Weeks earlier, when the first irregularities appeared, I had identified the pattern. It was subtle, but consistent enough to suggest human involvement rather than system error. Through the investigators, contact had been made. The employee agreed to cooperate, not out of loyalty to me, but out of recognition of what had been happening. From that point forward, everything had been recorded. Every request, every instruction, every attempt to move funds outside the boundaries of authorization. The system had not been compromised. It had been observed. I allowed the room a moment to process that. Vanessa's reaction was immediate. The certainty she had carried dissolved into disbelief, then into something less controlled. Her words lost structure. Her tone sharpened beyond restraint. Daniel did not speak. He no longer had anything to say. Around us, the shift was undeniable. The same voices that had questioned me now turned in a different direction. The doubt that had once filled the room found a new target, and it settled there with equal force. The Foundation's board members exchanged looks that no longer carried uncertainty, only realization. The situation had moved beyond explanation. It was no longer a question of what had happened, but of what would follow. I stepped back, allowing the distance to return between myself and the center of the room. There was no satisfaction in what I saw, no sense of triumph, only the quiet acknowledgement that the process had reached its conclusion. Everything that had been hidden was now visible. Everything that had been denied was now undeniable, and everything they had built in secrecy had collapsed in full view of the very people they had tried to deceive. There are moments when truth does more than reveal. It ends the illusion entirely. If you're still watching, and you're starting to see how everything was planned from the beginning, comment number 8 below, so I know you're with me. Now, let's move into the final outcome of this story. When I left the Foundation building that evening, the air outside felt unusually still, as if the world had paused to absorb what had just unfolded. The noise, the tension, the shifting loyalties inside that room had all fallen away the moment I stepped onto the quiet sidewalk. For the first time in weeks, there was nothing left to prove. I walked to my car without looking back. There was no sense of triumph in me, no satisfaction in having exposed them. What I felt instead was something quieter, more grounded, a closing, not of a conflict, but of a chapter that had been unraveling long before I chose to confront it. The legal consequences moved quickly after that. The Foundation's board had no choice but to report the findings. Within days, formal investigations expanded beyond internal review. Daniel was no longer operating in uncertainty. His actions were documented, his involvement clear. Charges followed, layered and unavoidable. Financial fraud, unauthorized access, misrepresentation, each one built upon the last, forming a structure he could not dismantle. Vanessa's situation unraveled just as rapidly. The corporate entity used to receive the transferred funds was identified and frozen. Accounts were locked. Transactions halted. Whatever control she believed she had secured disappeared in a matter of days. The system she had relied on turned against her with the same precision she once trusted. There were no more messages from either of them. No attempts to explain, no apologies, no arguments. The silence between us became absolute, not as a decision, but as a result. Whatever remained of our relationship had dissolved under the weight of what they had chosen to do. I allowed myself to acknowledge that loss, but I did not let it define me. Daniel had been my son. That truth did not disappear, but the person he had become, the decisions he had made, placed him beyond the reach of what I could accept. There are lines that, once crossed, do not allow for return. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because trust cannot be restored where it has been deliberately destroyed. In the weeks that followed, I made changes of my own. I restructured portions of my estate, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I established a foundation dedicated to protecting older individuals from financial exploitation, using my experience to create safeguards for those who might not recognize the warning signs in time. It was not an act of retaliation. It was a continuation of what I had always done, only now with a deeper understanding of how close the threat can be. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, though not unchanged. The house remained the same. The mornings were still quiet, the light still soft across the kitchen floor. But there was a difference in how I moved through those spaces, a steadiness that came not from routine, but from knowing exactly what I had preserved. Not everything is meant to be saved. Sometimes what remains is not what you held on to, but what you refuse to lose. And in the end, that is what matters. The mornings feel different now, though nothing about them has truly changed. I still wake before the sun rises. I still walk into the kitchen, prepare my coffee, and sit in the same chair where the light filters softly through the window. The house remains as it always has been, steady and familiar, holding the quiet rhythm of a life built over time. But the silence no longer carries the same weight. It is no longer something I retreat into. It is something I understand. I have had time to reflect, not on the details of what happened, but on what it revealed. It is easy to believe that family is permanent, that shared history creates an unbreakable bond. I believed that once. I believed that love, in its simplest form, was enough to sustain trust. But trust is not inherited. It is maintained. And when it is broken with intention, it does not return in the same shape. Daniel was my son. That truth remains, but it no longer defines the present. The person he became made choices that separated him from the life we once shared. Accepting that was not a moment. It was a process, one that required clarity more than emotion. There is a quiet assumption people make about age. They see it as a decline, a gradual fading of strength, awareness, and control. They mistake stillness for weakness and patience for confusion. What they don't understand is that time sharpens certain things. It teaches you how to observe without reacting, how to listen without revealing, how to wait without losing direction. I did not win anything. I did not set out to defeat anyone or to prove a point. I simply refused to ignore what was in front of me. I allowed the truth to unfold, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. What happened was not just about money. It was about choices, about what people become when they believe they are entitled to something they did not earn. Greed does not appear suddenly. It grows quietly, shaping decisions long before it becomes visible. In the end, I did not lose what mattered. I still have my home. I still have my independence. And more importantly, I still have the ability to see clearly, without illusion. People often think loss is measured by what is taken, but sometimes loss is what reveals what should never have been held onto in the first place. In the end, some truths arrive quietly, not with noise or chaos, but with a clarity that cannot be ignored. Life has a way of revealing what is real and what has only been tolerated for too long. Not every bond is meant to last, and not every loss is something to grieve. Sometimes, losing what no longer holds honesty or respect is the very thing that restores your sense of self. There is strength in seeing clearly, in choosing peace over illusion, and in standing firm when everything else begins to shift. What remains after everything falls away is not emptiness, but understanding. And that understanding becomes the foundation for a life lived on your own terms. Thank you for being here and listening to this story. If it resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.